There was a wonderful story about Hanukkah that concerns two lifelong friends named David and Joseph. Together, they survived the Holocaust in Poland. After the war, they raised their families in the same neighborhood, worked hard, and eventually retired. Though they never put it into words, they were the dearest of friends. They had so much in common, and they agreed about everything that is, except how to light the candles of the menorah. Joseph believed that on the first night of Hanukkah, all the candles of the menorah should be lit, and they should stay lit for all 8 nights. After all, Joseph reasoned, this was the way God had done it at the original Hanukkah so many years ago. God, he said, didn't make the lamp burn brighter as the week went on. Oh, you're full of it, David told him. You know nothing. Instead, he explained, following the more common practice, each night you light another candle, the first candle on the first night, the second, and so forth. That's to symbolize that each day, as the week went on, the faith of the Maccabees grew stronger and stronger. Unfortunately, David and Joseph just couldn't agree to disagree on how to light the menorah. So each year they argued, and each year Joseph would light all of the candles on his menorah on the first night, and David would light a single candle, then 2 the next night, and so on. And as they passed each other's windows, each would shake his head and mutter what a stubborn fool his dear friend was. One year, though, they argued as ever each night for the first 4 nights. But on the next night, things got a bit more heated than usual. Joseph was so angry, he turned to David at one point and said, "By all that is holy, you cannot even call yourself a Jew." A chill settled over the room. Neither of them had ever spoken to the other like that before. David then turned to Joseph and said, "Get out of my house." And Joseph did. On the next night, Joseph stayed home too. He didn't call, he didn't walk by David's house. But on the following night, he did go out, and as he passed David's home, he noticed that only 5 candles were lit. "Stubborn fool," he said. Now he's waiting until the last night to light them all. On the 6th night, though, no more candles were lit, nor on the 7th. At that point, Joseph started to worry. When there were no candles burning on the 8th night, the last night, he knew something must be wrong. So he went to the door and knocked, but there was no response, no answer. So he used the spare key to the apartment that David had given him years before, just in case. And when he opened the door, there sat his old friend, slumped in his chair in the living room, his chin down toward his chest. "Oh, my dear friend, what have you done?" cried Joseph. His heart filled with remorse. They had been through so much together, and now, nearing life's end, they had allowed this silly argument about how to light the candles to separate them. How could he have been such a fool, Joseph thought. He walked to the window and, taking a box of matches out of his coat pocket and then taking a single match in hand, he struck it and lit the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th candles on the menorah, so that on this, the last night of Hanukkah, all the candles were burning brightly. He stood at the window and through his tear-filled eyes gazed at the candles all aglow. And then he heard the voice behind him say, "Ha! You old goat, finally you've learned that the 8th candle can't be lit until the final night." I often think there is no more seductive temptation in this world than the very human urge to be right. It's an incredibly satisfying feeling, especially if we put a great deal of effort into convincing others of just how very correct we are. But when we look at our lives, when we look at human history, how much have we paid along the way for this privilege? What pain and suffering have we left in life's wake, all for the satisfaction of being proved right? As the story of David and Joseph shows, the price to be paid for that sense of satisfaction is sometimes painfully high. Giving a good my way or the highway ultimatum rarely feels as good and gratifying as we think it probably should. As it turns out, there's often a remarkably short distance between righteous indignation and self-righteous indignation, between genuine moral outrage and a feeling, perhaps misplaced, of moral superiority. This was a point I was reminded of recently when listening again to Barack Obama's address after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize many years ago. I found a great deal in his words to wrestle with, but the line that grabbed me was one he made in his extended argument for the notion of just war. Speaking of the need to sometimes engage in direct dialogue with repressive regimes, he acknowledged that doing so lacks what he called the satisfying purity of indignation. The satisfying purity of indignation. Whether recognized as such, this is not a quality not entirely unknown amongst many of us. Now, if you're wondering what any of this has to do with Hanukkah, let me say that it has everything to do with Hanukkah. Beyond the well-known story of the rededication of the temple, with its miraculous lamp burning for 8 days on just 1 day's oil, is a much more complicated and challenging story, one of conflict and oppression, sacrilege and violence. Even with the menorah set ablaze, and with the chocolate gelt, the delightful donuts, and the dreidel games at hand, Hanukkah is a hard holiday to hold on many levels. But if we dig below the surface and plumb the depths of its complexities, what emerges is a very human story, one that may ultimately be much more familiar than the tale of the oil itself. In the several centuries before the Common Era, the Jewish people found themselves living variously under the rule of the Persians, and then, thanks to Alexander the Great, as part of the Hellenistic kingdoms of Egypt and Syria. At that time and in that part of the world, with all its spiritual and ethnic diversity, religious persecution was actually quite rare. If the peace was kept and taxes paid, the authorities rarely meddled in matters of belief, and the Jews rarely had reason to rebel. More often than not, when a conflict arose, a delegation would just go to the king and work out an agreeable solution. Under those circumstances, many Jews not only embraced, but even willingly incorporated elements of Greek culture into their lives. While some were deeply concerned about Jews being assimilated into the dominant Hellenistic culture, things were relatively peaceful. That is, until King Antiochus came to power. For reasons that scholars still don't understand, something at that point sparked a dramatic shift, and religious persecution of the Jews suddenly became the order of the day. An altar to Zeus was erected in the center of the temple in Jerusalem, and key practices such as circumcision and keeping Sabbath were forbidden. Ritual sacrifices were to be made no longer to Yahweh, but to other gods. Now, as you might imagine, none of this went over so well. Tradition teaches that the first Jew to attempt making such a sacrifice was killed by a priest named Mattathias, who, with his 5 sons, fled to the hills for their safety. In time, one of those sons, Judas Maccabeus, raised an army of 6,000. And exactly 3 years after the statue of Zeus was erected in the temple, Judas and his followers overthrew their Greek rulers, and then they purified and rededicated the temple in a festival lasting for 8 days. This rebellion is the first recorded struggle for religious freedom, and an important turning point in resisting the assimilation of Judaism into the context of surrounding cultures. And while that sounds and is a laudable thing, we would do well to remember that the revolt pitted reform-minded Jews against more Orthodox Jews, the Maccabees, who wished to keep the faith exactly the way they had found it. During the revolt, the Maccabees expelled or killed many of the Jews who were the old guard in Jerusalem for not having kept the faith as pure as they thought it should be. What has long been viewed as a struggle between the Jews and their outsider oppressors is more likely to have been a civil war between the Orthodox Jews from the countryside and the more urban Jewish reformers in Jerusalem who had welcomed and embraced the influences of Greek culture. So as you can see, this makes for a somewhat complicated holiday for us as Unitarian Universalists. On one hand, it was a great victory for religious freedom. On the other, the theological conservatives were the ones that won. It was a mixed day for liberal religion. In time, the well-known story of the oil and the long-burning lamp emerged to soften the hard edges of the historical record, which not only put a positive spin and added God's blessing on the rededication of the temple, but also avoided upsetting the authorities when the Jews once again found themselves under foreign rule. Turns out that the public celebration of a past revolt was considered poor form, if not downright dangerous when living under Roman occupation. So it's fair to ask, some 22 centuries after the fact, just what this story, when deconstructed a bit, has to say. Plenty, I think. I, for one, find it a much richer story and much more satisfying than simply celebrating the oil that kept on burning for more than a week. I've never been that big on miracles anyway, and the messy story with its layers upon layers of conflict seems to have at least a real ring of truth about it. This version of the story, I think, has a great deal more to teach us. The first lesson I take from this more nuanced reading is that real religious freedom has to mean real religious freedom for everyone, for those who hold to the old ways, as well as those pushing the boundaries of belief. While I can appreciate the genuine fears of assimilation any minority group might feel, and absolutely abhor the kind of religious violence that would defile the sacred space of another or require people to violate the core commitments of their faith, I am sobered by this cautionary tale that reminds us of how easily the oppressed can become the oppressor. The historical story of Hanukkah, then, arguably calls us away from self-righteousness to a place of humility and curiosity, that we might extend true tolerance to others, especially those who find themselves in the minority, whether that be in our culture at large or within the very culture of our own congregation. It is important to remember that there are many ways to light the candles that bring light into the world. A second lesson I draw from this understanding of Hanukkah is the recognition that our UU approach to religion, our mixing and melding of different traditions, our constant evolution and openness to new understanding is objectionable, if not downright threatening to some. One of my professors in divinity school, a prominent Jewish scholar, who is well acquainted with UU students and taught a good number of us through the years at Harvard, pulled no punches in decrying what he calls our salad bowl faith. He finds our hyphenated postmodern faith lacking in integrity and our rituals illegitimate when untethered from the authority of biblical law and tradition. Now, this is, of course, a matter where we must agree to disagree, but I think it's important for us to be aware of this kind of critique, mindful of how we relate to those from other faiths, and cognizant of how we utilize rituals from traditions not our own. There are many ways to light the candles, but for those of us on the liberal end of the religious spectrum, we must do so with integrity and care, with respect for the traditions from which various rituals come, and with deep regard for the cultures that practice them. The last thing I would hold up for you concerns commitment. While we might wish the Maccabees had found within themselves a greater capacity for tolerance of their fellow Jews, we cannot say that they showed any lack of commitment to their ideals. I don't know about you, but I am usually quite uncomfortable, if not nervous, around people who are absolutely convinced they possess the truth. Not only can such certainty be tedious, it is, of course, all too often dangerous. But I do admire those who are inspired by their faith to a level of dedication that makes a difference in this world. To wit, I'm a bit envious of the Jewish law that requires menorahs be placed at Hanukkah in a window where they can be seen by others. There is no hiding one's light under a bushel here. At many points in history, this has been no small commandment, as it came with a certain level of risk for Jews to make their religious identity known. And with the worrisome rise of anti-Semitism we are seeing in our own time, there is, unfortunately, once again, some risk involved in lighting a menorah and placing it on the windowsill to be seen by the passers-by. I thought of telling you this morning that a new bylaw had been passed requiring every UU household to place a flaming chalice on their windowsill. But the truth is that such an act of faith and identity cannot be meaningfully commanded or compelled. It can, however, be inspired. So let us, during this festival of lights, be inspired by every menorah we happen to see, that we might truly cherish religious freedom for others as much or more than for ourselves, to honor our differences of belief and seek ever greater integrity within our own, and to consider the depth of our own dedication to this faith that is unfolding ever and always. In closing, I leave you with these words of blessing from UU Minister Mark Bellatini, the miracle of Hanukkah. The miracle is not that oil lasts, but that our hope lasts despite disappointment. Baruch atah tikva, blessed are you, hope. The miracle is not that fire illumines, but that we grow brighter. Baruch atah zohar, blessed are you, brightness. The miracle is not that people tell ancient stories, but that people dare to live their own stories. Baruch atah midrashim, blessed are you, stories. The miracle is not that tyranny is resisted, but that resistance recreates us into new beings. Baruch atah kadesh, blessed are you, new beings. The miracle is not that courage exists, but that courage does not every time have to ball itself into a fist. Baruch atah kayil, blessed are you, courage. With our one candle burning, may we do our part to bring forth the miracles of bright hope, stories of new being, and a heart full of courage. So may it be. Amen.